The wind howling through the Bitterroot Mountains screamed of an early, brutal winter, and widow Margaret Callahan had exactly one handful of cornmeal left. When a massive shadow darkened her rotting door, it wasn't the grim reaper. It was a giant of a mountain man. "Can you cook for two?" he asked. Her answer changed the frontier. By September of 1878, the Montana Territory had bled Margaret Callahan dry. Her husband, Thomas, a man with too much ambition and too little sense, had died of a fever in the spring, leaving her with an unfinished cabin, a patch of rocky soil, and a crushing silence. As the leaves on the cottonwoods turned the color of old coins, Margaret's supplies dwindled to nothing. Her cheekbones grew sharp, her hands calloused and thin. She was 26, but the frontier had etched a decade of hard lines around her eyes. She was waiting to freeze, or starve, whichever had the decency to take her first. It was a Tuesday afternoon, gray and biting, when the sound of heavy hooves broke the isolation. Margaret stood on her porch, her late husband's Winchester rifle gripped loosely in her trembling hands. The man who rode into her clearing didn't look like a savior. He looked like the wilderness given flesh. He rode a massive roan stallion and wore a heavy coat of cured elk hide. A thick, dark beard obscured the lower half of his face, but his eyes, a startling, icy blue, locked onto hers with the intensity of a predator. This was Ezekiel Rawlings. Men in the nearby settlement of Bannock spoke of him in hushed tones. Zeke was a mountain man, a trapper who had survived a grisly mauling and a Blackfoot war party. Rumor had it he had recently acquired a sprawling, untamed piece of land in the valley below, bought with gold dust panned from the icy rivers of the high country. Zeke stopped his horse 10 paces from the porch. He didn't dismount. He looked at the dilapidated cabin, the barren garden, and finally, at the frail woman holding a rifle she barely had the strength to lift. "Put the gun down, widow." Zeke's voice was a deep, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in Margaret's chest. "If I meant you harm, you'd already be in the dirt." Margaret didn't lower the barrel. "State your business, Mr. Rawlings. I know who you are." A faint, grim smile touched his lips. "Good. Saves me the introduction. I bought the old Miller spread down in the basin. Got 500 head of cattle, 3 ranch hands who don't know their left boot from their right, and a kitchen that smells like dead rats and burnt beans." He shifted in his saddle, leaning forward. The leather of his coat creaked in the silence. "I spend my days breaking horses and mending fences," Zeke continued. "I ain't got the time or the temper to cook. Word in town is you're starving out here, too proud to beg. So I'll make this simple." He locked eyes with her. "Can you cook for two?" Margaret stared at him. The proposition was blunt, devoid of pity, and entirely transactional. It was exactly what she needed. She didn't want charity. She wanted survival. "I can cook for a dozen if the larder is stocked," Margaret replied, her voice remarkably steady despite her racing heart. "But I don't work for free, and I don't take orders like a dog." Zeke chuckled, a low rumbling sound. "Room, board, and $10 a month. You keep the kitchen in line, and I'll keep the wolves off your porch. Pack your things. We ride out in an hour." Margaret lowered the rifle. She had 3 possessions to her name that mattered: her mother's cast-iron skillet, a woolen quilt, and her pride. She packed them all into a single canvas sack. When she locked the door to the hollow cabin, she didn't look back. She climbed into the saddle behind the mountain man, the scent of pine, wood smoke, and raw leather enveloping her. She didn't know it yet, but Margaret Callahan was riding toward an empire. The Miller spread Zeke had purchased was now called the Iron Pine Ranch, and calling it a mess was an insult to messes. The main house was a sprawling log structure that had been neglected for years. Mud was tracked across the floorboards, dirty plates were stacked high, and the 3 ranch hands, rough, unwashed drifters named Levi, Cletus, and an old-timer named Jeb, treated the place like a saloon. Margaret didn't weep. She didn't complain. She tied an apron over her faded dress, picked up a heavy wooden broom, and went to war. For the first week, Zeke was barely around. He left before dawn to push cattle out of the high ravines before the snows hit, returning long after dark. But the changes in the house were undeniable. The floors were scrubbed raw, the windows let in light, and the smell of sourdough biscuits, salted pork, and rich, thick coffee greeted the men when they stumbled out of the bunkhouse. But respect on the frontier isn't earned with a broom. It's taken through force of will. On her 8th day, Levi, a mean-spirited cowboy with a jagged scar across his chin, stomped into the kitchen with mud caked to his boots, tracking it deliberately across Margaret's freshly scrubbed floor. He sat at the long table, slammed his fist down, and demanded, "Where's the whiskey, woman? I ain't eating this slop without a drink." Margaret, who was standing at the cast-iron stove, slowly turned around. In her hand, she held her mother's heavy cast-iron skillet, slick with bacon grease, and hot enough to brand a steer. "You'll take your boots off before you cross that threshold, Levi," Margaret said, her voice dropping an octave, carrying a lethal calm. "And you will eat what I serve, when I serve it, or you will starve." Levi stood up, knocking his chair back. "You listen to me, you dried-up little widow. I take orders from Rawlings, not some charity case he dragged off the mountain." He took a step toward her. From the doorway, a shadow fell across the room. Zeke had returned early. He stood, leaning against the frame, thumbs hooked into his gun belt, watching the scene unfold. Levi didn't see him, but Margaret did. She didn't look to Zeke for help. She didn't flinch. As Levi reached out to grab her arm, Margaret swung the heavy skillet. She didn't aim for his head, she aimed for his pride. The hot iron smashed into Levi's reaching knuckles with a sickening crunch. The cowboy howled in agony, falling to his knees and clutching his blistering, broken hand. Margaret calmly set the skillet back on the stove. "Clean up the mud on your way out," she said. Zeke stepped fully into the room, his icy blue eyes gleaming with something that looked dangerously like admiration. He looked at Levi, who was whimpering on the floor. "You heard the lady," Zeke rumbled. "Pack your gear, Levi. You're off my land by sundown." That evening, the dynamic of Iron Pine shifted permanently. After the other hands had eaten in silent, terrified respect and scurried back to the bunkhouse, Zeke sat alone at the table. Margaret placed a plate of roasted venison and hot potatoes in front of him. "You didn't need to fire him," Margaret said softly, pouring him a cup of black coffee. "I had it handled." "I know you did," Zeke replied, cutting into the meat. He looked up at her, the flickering lantern light softening the harsh lines of his scarred face. "That's exactly why I fired him. A man who can't respect the woman keeping him alive is too stupid to watch my back on a cattle drive." A quiet, unspoken tension began to hum between them. It wasn't the fiery, reckless passion of youth. It was the slow, steady burn of two survivors recognizing the steel in one another. Over the next month, they found a rhythm. Zeke would sit by the hearth at night, carving wood or cleaning his revolver, while Margaret mended clothes and balanced the meager ledger she had found in a desk drawer. She realized quickly that Zeke was a brilliant woodsman, but a terrible businessman. He was being cheated by the mercantile in town, overpaying for feed and underselling his beef. Margaret took over the books. By late October, without Zeke ever officially asking, she wasn't just cooking for two. She was managing the finances of the Iron Pine Ranch. Winter did not arrive with a whisper. It arrived with an axe. In the second week of November, a blizzard swept down from the Bitterroots, burying the valley in 3 feet of snow overnight. The storm caught Zeke and the men out near the northern ridge, trying to herd a panicked group of strays into a box canyon for shelter. For 2 days, Margaret paced the floorboards of the cabin, keeping the fire blazing, staring out into the blinding white fury. The solitude she had once welcomed now felt like a physical weight pressing against her chest. She realized, with a terrifying jolt, that she wasn't just worried about losing her job. She was terrified of losing the gruff, silent mountain man who had given her a reason to breathe again. On the third morning, the wind broke. Shortly after dawn, Cletus and Jeb rode into the yard. Draped across the saddle of the roan stallion was Zeke Rawlings. Margaret flew out the door before the horses had even stopped. Zeke was pale, semi-conscious, and covered in blood. A panicked longhorn steer had gored his right thigh, tearing through the muscle, and the freezing temperatures had nearly done the rest. "Get him inside. On the table!" Margaret screamed, stripping off her apron to use as a tourniquet. For the next 4 hours, Margaret Callahan became a surgeon. She poured boiling water and whiskey over the gruesome wound, ignoring Zeke's agonizing groans. She threaded a thick needle with horsehair and stitched the torn flesh together, her hands steady, her face pale as a ghost. She packed the wound with a poultice of boiled pine needles and yarrow she had gathered in the fall, praying the infection wouldn't take his leg or his life. For a week, Zeke burned with a violent fever. He hallucinated, speaking in frantic, broken sentences about blood in the snow, about a man named Croft, and about Margaret's late husband, Thomas. Margaret sat by his bedside day and night, applying cool cloths to his forehead, her mind racing at the disjointed confessions slipping from his lips. Why was he talking about Thomas? By the 10th day, Zeke's fever broke. He awoke weak, battered, but alive. He looked at Margaret, who was asleep in a chair beside his bed, her hand resting on his arm. He didn't move to wake her. For the first time in his hard, violent life, Ezekiel Rawlings felt tethered to something. But the frontier rarely allows for peace. Zeke was still bedridden 2 weeks later when riders approached the ranch. Margaret was in the yard, bundled in a heavy wool coat, directing Cletus on how to ration the winter feed. She turned to see 5 men on horseback ride into the compound. They were heavily armed, wearing expensive dusters. At the front rode a man with a silver-tipped cane, a bowler hat, and a smile that didn't reach his cold, dead eyes. This was Harlan Croft, a ruthless debt collector and land baron from Denver who preyed on failing ranches. "Mrs. Callahan," Croft sneered, tipping his hat as he stopped his horse a few feet from her. "I must say, you look much healthier than the last time I saw you in Bannock." Margaret stood her ground, her heart pounding against her ribs. "My name is Mrs. Callahan, yes, but you are trespassing on Mr. Rawlings' land. State your business and leave." Croft laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Mr. Rawlings' land? I think not." He pulled a folded piece of heavy parchment from his coat pocket. "Your late husband, Thomas, was a man of magnificent vices. He owed me $5,000 in gambling debts and bad loans. Before he died, he put up the deed to this very basin as collateral." Margaret frowned, confusion washing over her. Thomas didn't own this basin. Zeke Rawlings bought this land. "Rawlings bought a fraudulent deed," Croft said smoothly, his men resting their hands on their holstered revolvers. "This land legally belongs to me. Now, I heard the mountain man is laid up, half dead, they say. So I'm giving you a choice, widow. You can pack your bags and walk out of here into the snow, or you can come work off your husband's debt in my establishments in Denver. I hear you're quite the domestic talent." The threat hung in the freezing air, heavy and vile. Cletus stepped forward, his hand on his rifle, but Croft's men immediately drew their weapons, aiming straight at the ranch hand's chest. "Hold, Cletus," Margaret ordered, her voice cutting through the tension like a whip. She looked at Harlan Croft. Then the pieces of Zeke's fever dream snapped into place. The ledger she had been balancing, the massive, unexplained withdrawal of funds Zeke had made in Bannock a month before she arrived. The way Zeke had looked at her cabin that first day. Zeke hadn't just stumbled upon her. He had known about the debt. "Let me see that paper, Mr. Croft," Margaret said, stepping forward with absolute authority. Croft, amused by her defiance, handed it down to her. Margaret read it. The signature was Thomas's, all right. But she also saw the date. "You're a fool, Harlan," Margaret said softly, looking up into his arrogant face. She turned and marched up the steps into the main house. Croft and his men dismounted, following her inside, expecting her to pack her bags. Instead, Margaret walked straight to Zeke's heavy oak desk. She opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a stack of documents tied with a leather cord. Zeke lay in the adjacent bedroom, awake, gripping his revolver beneath the blankets, listening to every word. He cursed his shattered leg, preparing to drag himself out and put a bullet in Croft's chest. But Margaret didn't need a gun. She walked back into the main room and threw a heavily stamped legal document onto the table. Thomas signed that collateral in March, Margaret said, her eyes blazing. But what he didn't tell you, Mr. Croft, is that he had already sold the mineral and grazing rights to this basin to a mining conglomerate out of Chicago in January to cover a different debt. The deed you hold is worthless paper. You own the dirt, but you can't graze a single cow or dig a single hole without trespassing on corporate claims. Croft's smile vanished. He snatched the paper off the table, his eyes scanning the legal jargon. His face turned an ugly shade of purple. Zeke Rawlings didn't buy the land from Thomas, Margaret continued, stepping closer to Croft, forcing the dangerous man to look at her. He bought the mineral and grazing rights directly from the Chicago conglomerate a week before he came to my cabin. He holds the true lease, and as the manager of the Iron Pine Ranch, I am telling you to get off our property before I have you arrested for armed trespass on a registered territorial claim. Croft glared at her, his hand twitching toward his gun. But the sheer, unyielding dominance in Margaret's posture gave him pause. She wasn't a starving widow anymore. She was the matriarch of the valley. "This isn't over, widow," Croft hissed, crumbling the paper. "It is for you," a voice rumbled from the bedroom doorway. Everyone turned. Zeke Rawlings stood leaning heavily against the doorframe, his face pale, sweat on his brow, but holding a leveled Winchester rifle aimed directly at Harlan Croft's face. "The lady told you to leave, Harlan," Zeke growled, thumbing back the hammer. The metallic click echoed like a cannon shot in the quiet room. "Next sound you hear is thunder." Croft swallowed hard. He looked at the giant mountain man, then at the fierce, unblinking woman standing beside him. They were a fortress of iron and ice. Without another word, Croft turned and walked out, his men following closely behind. When the sound of their horses faded into the snow, Zeke lowered the rifle. His legs gave out. Margaret was there in an instant, catching his massive frame, bearing his weight as she helped him back to the bed. She laid him down, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She stood over him, her hands on her hips, her eyes filled with a storm of emotion. "You bought the lease to save me from Thomas's debts," she said, her voice shaking. "Not with fear, but with fury. You knew Harlan Croft would come for me eventually. You staged the whole thing. You didn't just need a cook." Zeke looked up at her, the rugged, terrifying mountain man stripped bare. "No, Maggie," he whispered gruffly, using her nickname for the very first time. "I didn't need a cook. I needed a partner. And I figured if you could survive Thomas Callahan, you might just be strong enough to survive me." The revelation hung in the stifling warmth of the cabin, heavier than the snow burying the Montana territory outside. Zeke Rawlings, a man who had wrestled grizzlies and survived the unforgiving wild, had engineered his entire acquisition of the Iron Pine Ranch to shield a woman he barely knew from a monster he knew all too well. Margaret didn't swoon. She didn't weep with gratitude. She walked over to the wash basin, dipped a rag into the freezing water, and returned to Zeke's bedside, gently wiping the fever sweat from his brow. "You're a reckless fool, Ezekiel Rawlings," she murmured, her voice stripped of its usual armor. "Harlan Croft isn't a man who takes defeat and rides quietly into the sunset. He's got half the politicians in Helena in his pocket and enough Pinkerton muscle on his payroll to burn this valley to bedrock." "Let him try," Zeke rasped, his massive hand coming up to wrap around her wrist. His skin was rough as tree bark, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. "I've got the high ground, a Winchester, and the smartest damn woman in the territory running my books." That night marked the true beginning of their partnership. The transactional boundaries dissolved, replaced by a profound, unspoken bond forged in the crucible of survival. As December bled into a brutal January of 1879, The iron pine became a fortress isolated from the rest of the world. The snowdrifts reached the eaves of the bunkhouse. Margaret's days were a grueling marathon of logistics. She meticulously rationed the winter feed, calculated the firewood down to the last cord, and stretched their provisions with a culinary ingenuity that kept the men strong and their spirits high. She turned salted beef, dried apples, and meager flour into feasts that Cletus and Jeb devoured with religious reverence. Zeke's recovery was agonizingly slow. The fever had cooked the strength from his massive frame, and the gored thigh left him with a pronounced, permanent limp. But as his body healed, his mind remained razor-sharp. During the long, dark evenings by the hearth, he taught Margaret the brutal realities of the frontier. He showed her how to strip and oil a Colt single-action Army revolver, how to pack a paper cartridge, and how to read the subtle shifts in the wind that signaled a coming blizzard or an approaching rider. In return, Margaret taught him the power of the pen. She drafted letters to Governor Benjamin F. Potts, officially registering the Iron Pines brand and filing formal grievances against Croft's predatory lending practices, ensuring a paper trail existed in the territorial capital. But outlaws don't fight with paper. The first strike came in the dead of February. The moon was a sliver of ice in a starless sky when the frantic lowing of cattle echoed from the southern holding pens. Margaret bolted upright in her cot, the cold floorboards biting her bare feet. Before she could grab her robe, Zeke was already at the window, his heavy coat thrown over his long johns, peering through the frosted glass with his Winchester in hand. "Riders," Zeke growled, his breath pluming in the freezing room. "4 of them. They've cut the wire and are driving the heifers toward the ridge." "Croft's men," Margaret said, her heart hammering as she pulled on her boots and grabbed the heavy woolen coat she'd fashioned from a surplus Army blanket. "Stay here, Maggie," Zeke ordered, shoving a box of ammunition into his pocket. "The devil I will," she snapped, grabbing the shotgun from above the mantel. She checked the double barrels with a practiced snap of her wrist. "Those are my cattle, too, Ezekiel." Zeke looked at her, the flickering lantern light catching the fierce, unyielding set of her jaw. He didn't argue, he just nodded. They plunged into the howling wind, moving toward the bunkhouse. But before they could reach it, the night erupted in gunfire. 2 sharp cracks of a rifle echoed from the ridge, followed by a sickening silence. Zeke and Margaret found Cletus pinned down behind a water trough, returning fire blindly into the dark. "Where's Jeb?" Zeke roared over the wind. Cletus pointed a trembling finger toward the broken fence line. "He ran out first, boss. They were waiting for him." Zeke motioned for Margaret to stay low, his massive frame moving with a surprising, predatory grace despite his limp. He disappeared into the blowing snow. Margaret crouched beside Cletus, her fingers numb, the shotgun heavy against her shoulder. Minutes stretched into eternity. The freezing wind bit through her layers, but the ice in her veins was colder. Finally, a shadow emerged from the squall. It was Zeke, dragging a body by the collar. He pulled the man into the meager shelter of the barn. It was Jeb. The old-timer was dead, a neat bullet hole through his chest. But as Margaret knelt beside him, a piece of silver caught the lantern light. Clutched tightly in Jeb's dead, frozen hand was a heavy, minted coin. It wasn't American currency. It was a Denver banking token, the exact kind Harlan Croft used to pay his enforcers. Zeke stared at the coin, his jaw clenching so hard the muscles jumped beneath his beard. He wasn't running out to stop them, Zeke said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He was running out to meet them. Jeb was Croft's rat. He unlatched the gates. Margaret looked down at the old man who had eaten her biscuits just hours before. The betrayal stung, but the reality of their situation was far worse. Croft wasn't just trying to rustle cattle. He was trying to starve them out, bleeding them from the inside. "They only took 20 head, Zeke noted, examining the tracks in the snow before the wind erased them completely. "It's a probing attack. They want to see how weak we are." Margaret stood up, her grip tightening on the shotgun. "Then we don't let them see weakness. We bring the rest of the herd into the home pasture. If they want our livelihood, they'll have to walk through our front door to get it." Over the next 3 weeks, the iron pine became a pressure cooker. Margaret and Zeke barely slept. They fortified the main house, boarding up the lower windows and setting up firing positions. They brought the remaining 400 head of cattle into the narrow basin directly behind the house, feeding them the absolute last of their winter reserves. The tension between Margaret and Zeke evolved from a quiet partnership into an undeniable, burning devotion. One night, while wrapping Zeke's leg with fresh bandages, Margaret felt the tremors of exhaustion in his massive frame. She looked up, her hands lingering on his knee, and saw the raw vulnerability in his icy blue eyes. "If Croft brings a dozen men," Zeke whispered, the firelight casting long shadows across his scarred face, "I want you to take the roan and ride north. Go to the federal marshal in Missoula. Don't look back." Margaret stood, bridging the small distance between them. She reached out, her calloused fingers tracing the rough line of his jaw. "I stopped running the day you rode into my clearing, Ezekiel Rawlings. I am not leaving this ranch, and I am certainly not leaving you." Zeke pulled her down, burying his face in the crook of her neck, his massive arms wrapping around her as if she were the only anchor holding him to the earth. It wasn't a romance of poetry and flowers. It was a love forged in blood, cordite, and the desperate will to survive. March arrived, turning the Montana snow into a treacherous, knee-deep sludge of mud and ice. The rivers swelled, roaring through the canyons like angry gods, and with the thaw came Harlan Croft. He didn't sneak in under the cover of darkness this time. He came at high noon. Margaret was on the porch, a steaming mug of coffee in her hands, when she saw the riders crest the southern ridge. There were 15 of them, hired guns, hard-eyed regulators from Cheyenne and Denver, heavily armed and riding in a loose, tactical formation. In the center rode Croft, his silver-tipped cane resting across his saddle horn. Zeke stepped out onto the porch, his Winchester hanging loosely at his side, the heavy Colt strapped to his thigh. Cletus, terrified but loyal, stood by the barn with a rifle. "Go inside, Maggie," Zeke said quietly. "Not a chance," she replied, picking up her shotgun from the porch swing. The riders fanned out in a semicircle, 50 yards from the house, trapping the iron pine compound against the steep rocky cliffs behind the cattle pens. Croft nudged his horse forward, a smug, venomous smile on his face. "Spring cleaning, Rawlings," Croft shouted across the muddy yard. "I heard you had a rat problem. Shame about old Jeb, but I'm afraid the debt has come due. The bank in Denver has officially declared your lease forfeit due to outstanding liens. I have a court order from Judge Orville Hickman himself authorizing the repossession of this livestock. Judge Hickman's jurisdiction ends at the territorial line." "Croft!" Margaret yelled back, stepping to the edge of the porch. "This is sovereign territory, and you are trespassing with an armed militia." Croft's eyes narrowed. "I warned you, widow. I tried to be civilized. Boys," he said, turning to his men, "burn the house, kill the men, take the cattle, but leave the woman breathing. I have a special place for her in my Denver parlors." The men raised their rifles. "No!" Margaret screamed. She didn't raise her shotgun at the men. She raised it toward the sky and pulled the trigger. The thunderous boom echoed off the canyon walls. It wasn't a shot meant to kill. It was a signal. High up on the cliffs, overlooking the narrow basin where the cattle were penned, a hidden figure moved. It was a local Shoshone trapper named Chatan, a man whose life Zeke had saved 3 winters prior during a grizzly attack. Margaret had secretly sent Cletus to find him 2 nights ago, carrying a burlap sack filled with something far more precious than gold, 12 sticks of commercial blasting dynamite, liberated from her late husband's old mining supplies. The moment Margaret's shotgun blasted, Chatan lit the long fuses and hurled the bundled dynamite into the narrow, rocky gorge that served as the only exit behind the ranch. The explosion was catastrophic. The ground heaved violently, throwing half of Croft's men from their horses. A deafening roar tore through the valley as tons of shale, ice, and granite sheared off the cliff face, crashing down into the gorge. But Margaret hadn't aimed to crush the riders. She had aimed to trap them. The explosive shock wave triggered a massive stampede. 400 head of panicked, half-starved longhorn cattle, terrified by the blast, spun around. The gorge behind them was blocked by tons of fresh rubble. They had only one way to run, forward, straight through the ranch yard, straight at Harlan Croft and his men. "Stampede!" one of the regulators screamed, terror replacing his bravado. "Fire! Shoot the led cows!" Croft roared, his horse rearing wildly. But it was like trying to stop a tidal wave with a pistol. A wall of horns, muscle, and muddy hooves surged forward. "Get back!" Zeke grabbed Margaret's waist, dragging her into the house and slamming the heavy oak door shut just as the first wave of the herd thundered past the porch. The sheer force of the stampede shook the cabin to its foundations. Outside, chaos reigned. Croft's men were caught in the open mud. Horses panicked, throwing their riders into the churning sea of cattle. Gunfire erupted, wild and desperate, but it was drowned out by the bellowing of the herd and the snapping of bone and timber. Zeke kicked out the wooden boards covering a broken window, bringing his Winchester up. Through the swirling dust and mud, he saw Croft's regulators scattering, abandoning their boss to save their own lives. Several were trampled. The rest spurred their horses back toward the southern ridge, fleeing the valley entirely. But Harlan Croft was trapped. His horse had been gored by a passing steer, dropping the suited man into the freezing mud. He scrambled backward, his bowler hat crushed, his silver cane lost, frantically trying to pull a derringer from his vest pocket. Zeke didn't shoot him. He stepped out onto the porch as the tail end of the herd passed, the mud settling in the ruined yard. He limped down the steps, his icy eyes locked onto the pathetic, shivering man in the dirt. Croft aimed the tiny pistol at Zeke's chest, his hand shaking violently. "Stay back, you savage! I am a legitimate businessman. I have the law on my side." Before Zeke could reach him, a sharp, authoritative voice rang out from the edge of the tree line. "Drop the weapon, Croft, or I'll take your hand off at the wrist." Riding into the clearing, flanked by 4 deputies, was United States Marshal Caleb Wyatt. He looked at the devastation, the mud, the scattered cattle, the fleeing regulators, and the ruined dandy in the mud. Marshal Wyatt rode up to the porch, touching the brim of his hat to Margaret, who had just stepped outside, her shotgun still in hand. "Mrs. Callahan," Wyatt said, a hint of a smile touching his weathered face. "I received your letters to the governor. Took me a while to navigate the snowpack from Missoula. Seems you and Mr. Rawlings had things well in hand." "We managed, Marshal," Margaret said smoothly, lowering the shotgun. "Mr. Croft here was just trying to steal our livelihood and murder my husband." Zeke blinked, looking back at Margaret. "Husband?" Wyatt looked down at Croft, who was now surrounded by deputies. "Harlan Croft, I have federal warrants for your arrest regarding wire fraud, extortion, and the unlawful hiring of mercenaries across territorial lines. Cuff him, boys." As the deputies hauled a screaming, protesting Croft onto the back of a spare horse, Wyatt tipped his hat one last time. "I'll have men round up the strays you folks lost. I suspect Judge Hickman in Denver is going to have a very rough federal inquiry headed his way soon. Good day to you both." When the lawmen rode out, taking the shadow of Harlan Croft with them forever, the iron pine fell into a profound, ringing silence. The sun broke through the heavy gray clouds, casting brilliant rays of gold across the snow-capped bitterroots. Zeke stood in the muddy yard, his chest heaving, his rifle lowered. He looked at the barricaded house, the surviving cattle grazing near the tree line, and finally at the woman on the porch. Margaret walked down the steps, her boots sinking into the mud. She stopped in front of the giant mountain man. Her hair was a mess, her hands were bruised, and her face was smudged with gunpowder and dirt. To Ezekiel Rawlings, she was the most breathtaking sight God had ever put on the earth. "Husband, huh?" Zeke rumbled, a slow, genuine smile cracking through his thick beard for the first time in his life. "Well," Margaret said, her eyes flashing with a fierce, joyful light, "I figured since I'm already balancing your books, fixing your leg, and blowing up your cliffs, I might as well take half the profits legally. Besides, it's highly improper for a widow to live alone with a mountain man. Zeke dropped his rifle into the mud. He reached out, pulling her flush against his chest, lifting her off the ground. He kissed her, not with the desperation of survival, but with the burning promise of a lifetime. By the summer of 1881, the Iron Pine Ranch was the largest and most prosperous spread in the Montana Territory. They didn't just survive the wilderness, they tamed it. Ezekiel Rawlings remained the terrifying enforcer of the valley, but everyone from Bannock to Helena knew the true power of the iron pine rested in the hands of his wife. Margaret Rawlings never forgot the hunger of her first winter, ensuring that no traveler was ever turned away from her kitchen. She had started as a starving widow who was asked if she could cook for two. By the end, she fed an empire and ruled it with an iron skillet and a heart of gold. Wow, what an incredible journey of grit, survival, and unexpected love. Margaret went from a starving widow to the absolute boss of the frontier. If you were on the edge of your seat watching Margaret and Zeke take down Harlan Croft, hit that like button. Share this incredible true-to-life Wild West saga with your friends. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more epic historical dramas and frontier legends. What would you have done in Margaret's shoes? Let us know in the comments below.